You may have noted, if you were a close reader, that there's two people of the three on the program. Unfortunately, Sean Yam, who was due to speak first, had a health emergency very much last minute, and we are concerned about him, but he is unable to join us, and of course sends apologies. So the plan for the first panel is that rather than go all the way till 6 o'clock, we're going to go till 5:30. Some of you just came from the airport, I appreciate knowing that. And this panel will go till 5:30, and then we'll have a reception after that. And if you are someone who leaves before that and grab a program, please note that over the course of the 4 days that we'll be here, we'll be in different locations. So we're not in this room tomorrow, we're in a different room. The program has this very lovely color-coded map, but please don't hesitate to ask any of us who you know are around here where to go if that's the case. Okay. I will introduce the first speaker, I have the paper, and then I'll introduce Paul. So Jonathan Wyrtzen, you have programs, so I will not repeat that biography that's in there, but except to say that Jonathan Wyrtzen is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale University, and his book, his new book, any moment, literally, Making Morocco, Colonial Intervention and the Politics of Identity, is coming out in days, as I understand it, from Cornell University Press, or is it weeks? Days. Weeks can be measured in multiples of 7. Making Morocco, Colonial Intervention and the Politics of Identity examines how, within the colonial political field created during the French and Spanish protectorates, 4 pillars of Moroccan identity, religion, ethnicity, territory, and the role of the monarchy, became indelibly politicized through state-society interactions involving a wide range of Moroccan and colonial actors. You know, you hear often that people are very excited for a book to come out, and those of us who are working on Morocco are truly, really very much looking forward to and excited about this book coming out soon. He has published numerous articles in journals such as Nations and Nationalism, on anti-colonial protest, and the violences of knowledge. He has published books and reviews in any number of journals and book collections, and we are thrilled to have him here to open up the conference. The title of his paper is Reimagining Political Space, Empire, Jihads, and the Interwar Making of the Modern Middle East and North Africa. Jonathan Wyrtzen.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Millie Hisham. It's so great to be in Evanston. It's my first time. I'm a first-timer. When I got contacted about the conference, the call was for current new work theorizing Middle East and North Africa. So this is very new. This is very current. This is my next book project. And so what I wanted to talk about today is kind of the conceptual apparatus that I'm working with, the questions that I'm asking, that I do really think engage the thematic foci that Jessica laid out for how do we talk about this region, how do we talk about the transformations that are happening right now. I want to say one thing just on this map right here is reimagining political space, and I put up a map that doesn't have any political space, and that's very intentional, and I want to be unpacking why we need to reimagine political space. And part of this is just trying to gain perspective. I'm in a sociology department, I'm a historian, I put social science and history together. And so part of the leverage that I have in kind of having a counterfactual is the historical. And I'm going to be turning to that today to try to get at some, giving us some leverage, some perspective in order to have a different angle on the events that are happening right now. Obviously, since 2011, the interstate system that's in the region has entered a period of rapid transformation, of dramatic transformation. Parts of that system have really devolved into something that doesn't resemble anything close to a nation-state unit. And you have, with the increasing, in the past weeks, with Russia's increasing intervention in Syria, you're just seeing this very hyper, exaggerated kind of effect of the ways that the supranational, and then especially in a case like Syria, the subnational are really the dominant forces that they're intersecting and they're overlapping in a place like Syria. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this project. So basically, the present challenge as we think about I think the current Middle East and North Africa is how do we conceptualize these complex and highly dynamic new type of a political geography, a political topography, in a place at which that's beyond kind of just a pure static state framework. And in that space, these both state and non-state actors, local and translocal actors are important. You have aspiring state builders, you have state defenders, etc. And you have regional and extra-regional powers that are interfering. So how do we develop these type of post-state centric models that can account for this plurality rather than a Weberian sort of monopoly when we think about political space? So part of this is, I think, if we can just step back and think about, even personally, how do we imagine political space? What are our presuppositions? What are the categories that we just start with when we think about that question, both in the past and in the present? And I think one of the things you can think about is the ways that we start. I think the typical approach is a static rather than a dynamic approach to political space. So we think of containers, we think of the map the color-coded map that we grew up with, or maybe this is a puzzle that you put together, that has stable units rather than dynamic ones. Similarly, in terms when we think about political space, most of us are very much oriented towards a state-centered perspective rather than a non-state-centered perspective. So we think of the political in terms of state rather than non-state. Again, in a different twist on that, how do we think of political space as a unit or a boundary of analysis, so a given political space as a thing that's there that we then put things inside of, or we trace processes within that, versus the actual space itself as an outcome, as a process that's in time, that's happening in time, that's dynamic. And similarly, these are kind of just taking different swings at the same sort of question, is, are we thinking about this in a historicized versus an ahistorical? And this was something Jessica talked about, is the ways in which we think of political units that exist or that are brought into being. That makes it, these nuances really shape the ways that we approach the ontology of political space. Similarly, do we think in terms of nations, in terms of the national political space, versus something that's above or below that? And so these are the themes that are going through my mind as I'm approaching a topic, which is a historical questions, a historical research site, where all of us, if you're a historian, you're always driven by the present. Our questions are framed by the present. So in thinking of conceiving in this project in the past five or so years, obviously the current transformations in the region have greatly shaped my imagination, how I'm trying to question this. And this draws me back to the interwar period. So why should we look at the interwar period? And I love the title here, right? Disputed lands of the Near East that hold world attention today, right? Of course, these are still disputed lands that hold the world's attention today. But there's a very strong reason, I think there's a very strong justification, it's probably obvious, why the interwar period, why World War I is a type of exogenous shock that sort of opens up a moment at which political space is in play, it's fluid, and that it's being reshaped. And to understand 2011, 2015, going back 100 years there's a critical juncture there that we need to understand. And I would argue that if we can do, from my perspective as a historical social scientist, if you do really good empirical, conceptual, theoretically informed work on that, I'm not going to say like, well, I'm going to walk in and have my policy recommendation to the White House, but we can come up with better apparatus to deal with where we are today, which I think really resembles that moment. So let's talk about what are the gaps in that, how we think of that earlier moment. A lot of people in this room have taught your Middle East survey of some sort, and you deal with the war, you deal with the making of the modern Middle East. So I want to think about the kind of received wisdoms or the common, some of this is academic, and there's obviously a lot more critical perspective on this within the academy, but there's also just like, what do you get in the New York Times, what do you get in a kind of layman's understanding of how the modern Middle East was made. First, who does the work? The British and the French screwed up the Middle East, right? That's this dominant interpretation, is that the lines were drawn by the French, and if I knew that I had more time, I was going to put up a Daily Show sketch in which Jon Stewart, back at some point in the past 4 years, and he has John Oliver with a pith helmet on, sipping whiskey and just drawing a map, and really locating the blame for this in these arbitrary, artificial borders that had no respect to something that, obviously the assumption there's some assumed natural given category of the political that should have been put in place, and that would not have resulted in the problems that we have today. So there's a definite emphasis on the British and the French that overlooks the ways that local actors, local movements, local political figures, local populations were very much also involved in the production of political space that emerges after the war. Second, a lot of the scholarship is retrospectively or anachronistically still oriented by national units that don't exist. So you trace the Syrian revolt at a moment in which Syria's not quite there. Or, for my own work, you think of a Morocco in 1915 that doesn't exist. There is no Morocco in the sense that modern Morocco exists. And we could talk about that more in the Q&A. But we dehistoricize the kind of outcomes, and then we go back and trace how that came to be, with the assumption that it's already going to be there. And so it's a kind of suspension of the contingency of the present historically. Third, a failure to consider the role of space in contingent as well as structural processes. And this is kind of what I was hinting at in that prior comment. So really considering contingency, counterfactuals, and not building in too much on continuity and the structures that dictated the outcomes. And then finally, and I think this is really relevant, and I love that Northwestern has a Center for Middle East and North Africa Studies, because what's happening in the interwar period is typically Sharq al-Assad centric, right? We think of the Middle East, that's where the action is, that's where the Ottoman Empire was, that's where the mandates are, etc. And what I think is important in the interwar period is the linkages, the transnational, the space that is connected in the interwar period from Morocco to what becomes Iraq. So bringing these together in how we think about political space and how it's being negotiated and defined in the interwar period. Okay, so to give perspective on this, and this is coming at that first point that I made, this overemphasis on the role of the British and the French. And this is kind of my screw Sykes-Picot point, which is a bit strong, but there's an overemphasis on Sykes-Picot, the agreement in 1916 between Georges Picot, the French diplomat, and Mark Sykes, the British one, where they divide the Middle East, a secret agreement. And what my argument is in this study is that nothing is determined in 1916. That map does not look like anything that emerges in the Middle East after the war. So historicizing these agreements, and also historicizing that these agreements do not dictate political realities after the war, is one of the purposes of this. And it's to break out of this mold that a European planner in Paris or London dictated the shape of the Middle East after the war. This is another one, the Treaty of Sèvres, the Paris Peace Conference, this settlement that is kind of taken as, again, if we're teaching a survey class and we'll put it up and we'll say, you've got Sykes-Picot, you've got Hussein McMahon, you've got the Balfour Declaration, and that's where the modern Middle East comes from. And I'm pushing against that, saying, no, those sets and terms, they were starting points that then go through a ton of negotiation. So Sèvres also doesn't map onto anything that ends up existing in the Middle East. And then, so what I'm going to talk about, and just take a snapshot quickly in the time that I have, you think about 1925, and again, this is a map that's very misleading, because much of this is a reification of something that's much more messy, much more fluid, and much more non-mappable in this kind of conventional sense. Because if you start from the west, in 1925, Abdul Karim, the leader of a state-building movement in northern Morocco in the Rif Mountains, is sitting, well, one, Morocco is divided into two different colonial territories. The northern territory, the Spanish territory, is functionally not under Spanish control. It's actually under Rifi control, or under Abdul Karim's control. He's threatening the French 40 kilometers away from Fez. The space of Morocco itself is absolutely in flux and is indeterminate in 1925. Nobody knows what will happen in Morocco in 1925. If you look at Libya, which is obviously one of the most egregious fabrications on the map, the Italians didn't even put Libya together until the 1930s, but at the moment in 1925, they actually have control over a fraction, maybe a third of that territory, and the Senussis are running a functional proto-state in the east, in Cyrenaica or Jebel Akhdar, that has sovereignty, it has functional autonomy, and they're not going to be done with that until 1932. Syria in 1925 is barely under French control. If you wait till the fall, Jebel Druze is revolted, and so they're coming apart. Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal does not have eastern Anatolia under control. The Kurds in northern Kurdistan there's multiple revolts that will extend into the 1930s. That, again, until yesterday, right? This is an open question. Southern Kurdistan is also not under British control, and that entire border between Iraq and the Najd, between Iraq and Transjordan, none of that is defined. All of those boundaries are absolutely fictional and imaginary. None of them have been defined. So this is what the crux of this study is, to say, those treaties, the planning that's being done is ignoring historical facts. It's ignoring the historical reality of how political space was actually generated. So what I want to do is just pull that off, pull those presumptions off of what we expect is going to happen, because we know at the end of the story, and think about the contingency of the interwar period and what kind of causation, what kind of factors are actually driving the story there. So my intervention here is temporally to push beyond the war, push beyond World War I and the agreements and this kind of Eurocentric narrative, push beyond the post-war, the Paris Peace Conference, that settlement and the terms of the post-war settlement, into the 1920s, into the 1930s even. I mean, if you count the Palestinian revolt, this isn't settled until 1939. Arguably, it's not settled. Spatially, thinking beyond this focus, this wartime conferences, etc., Paris focus, even beyond Cairo, beyond Damascus, these urban centers, out into the rural areas which are actually driving the story and actually where political space is going to be defined through processes that are happening out there. And secondly, spatially, putting the Middle East and North Africa in exactly the same frame of reference. Because from the Rif to Kurdistan, all of these developments are interlinked. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how I'm going to go about this, what the method through which I'm trying to take this different approach to these questions. And it really has to do with case selection. And I think case selection can bypass a lot of the problems that I've been articulating. So what I want to do is, instead of taking a unit as the case, I'm taking sites of friction, sites of conflict, where political space is in play. And so I've selected 5 different revolts. Again, in the West, you have the Rif War, from something from 1919 to 1926 is when the phenomenon is happening. The Senussi Revolt, Omar Mukhtar, etc. The Syrian Revolt, 25 to 27. These Kurdish revolts that are happening both in northern Kurdistan and what's going to become Turkey, and in southern Kurdistan, which is going to become Iraq. And then putting the Najd, putting the Hijaz War and the creation of political space within the Arabian Peninsula. Again, a contingent outcome. Nobody knows in 1924 for sure what's going to happen, what the outcome is going to be. There's no Saudi Arabia yet. It's a potential, and it's a contest that's happening there. So by choosing on these, what you can get, the kind of leverage you can get out of this is, one, it's a way to do And part of this is an intervention into how international history, global international turn in history and historical science is going, is to choose a unit that is not just, well, we're going to do the international by doing empire. Trying to go even beyond that and say, how do you deal with the local in the translocal? How do you connect the local to these broader concerns? And I don't like the word transnational, because it's still we're semantically linked to a unit that I have a lot of trouble with. So I don't know that there's a great word, but something like the translocal. Secondly, the scope conditions themselves structurally prevent me from getting into methodological nationalism. So I have to deal with beyond the nation. I can't sit within that as a kind of a static category, even implicitly. Part of this is the ways that you can get these sort of intersectional translocal local dynamics is that a phenomenon like the Reef War is cross-border. So things that are happening in Algeria and in the French zone of Morocco are fundamentally integral to the story of what's happening in the Spanish zone in Morocco. The Syria revolts interly connected to how the Sunnis are able to tap resources in British-controlled Egypt. Syria's a basket case of cross-border factors. You also have to deal with internal factors within empires, the intra-empire. So again, the Reef War, when the French come in 1926, and how that in 1925, 1926, and how that's affecting what's happening in French-controlled Syria. You also have to do cross-empire, and part of this is bringing the Spanish and the Italians in, because we think of the British and the French as the only colonial powers, but of course the Spanish and the Italians as secondary powers are really important in this story too. The cases themselves, and this is where the local or the regional also has direct horizontal connections. They are interdependent. And I'm painting a historical picture, and hopefully you're connecting the dots to the present. You have phenomena in the Reef, for instance, where obviously Abdul Karim and his forces are conducting operations when the French come in. The people in Syria are synchronically, they're aware of what's happening elsewhere. People in Kurdistan are aware of what's happening elsewhere. Ibn Saud is aware. So these are also directly interdependent themselves. So I'm not looking at siloed cases and trying to come up with varied outcomes, etc. I'm looking at a very complex, intersected case. And then finally, bringing in the three pieces that I think are fundamental, that you can't ignore any one of them. So it is that bigger story. So the empires do have something in the story, but it's also these regional and local factors that are important. And then, as I mentioned, I think one of my major priorities is to put the Maghreb and the Mashriq in the same frame and demonstrate how the production of political space, the emergence of these units, takes place across the region. I'm going to need to wrap up in terms of time. I'll give you just a little bit of the insights you can get from thinking about these as the cases. One is just thinking in terms of these movements, and so somewhat relevant to the present, that a phenomenon like ISIS, or a phenomenon like Rajawa, a phenomenon name something that's happening right now. It's not aberrational. It's part of more fundamental historical continuities, I would say, that you have this, this is not the first time these things have happened. And on that side is that you had in this moment in the 1920s as these aspirational state builders. They're protecting local autonomy against some sort of an outside threat, whether that is colonial or another local state builder, that mobilize a kind of state-like resistance against that. You see Abdul Karim, Omar Mokhtar, Ibn Saud in a special way, and Mustafa Kemal is bidirectional. He's protecting Turkish autonomy and pushing out Turkish autonomy on other groups. You have some that are just anti-state. They do not come up with state-like structures. I list those. And then hybrid movements that kind of don't fit quite in either category there. And then there's some other dimensions that you can look at, the degrees to which polarity, so the sort of local plurality of political, aspirational political orders, how those are dense or maybe less dense. Some of these are sort of more binary oriented, and some of them are very multipolar. So I think something that I just want to draw a contrast here between, and this is going to connect to the present, Libya and Syria. And if you look at the density of sort of multiple layers that are happening in Syria versus Libya, I think this is a descriptive typology, but I think you can start to get unpacking some explanation out of it, some of the causation that has to do with the spatial dimensions of these different cases. I'll talk about that in the conclusion in one moment to explain that more. So just to wrap up with some comments here. By saying reimagining political space, I'm asking for us to historically reimagine political space. I want to look at how the actors themselves were reimagining political space, historicize that, put that into temporality, that in 1915, if you're in Jerusalem, Michelle Campos is what people are thinking of as political space is not what they're thinking of in 1925 and 2035 and 45. It's a dynamic category that's being reimagined constantly through this period, especially very rapidly during the period that I'm considering. And that's being done on the part of Europeans who didn't just decide what they wanted to do in 1915. They had to keep reimagining it through time all the way up to the eve of World War II. Secondly, that this historically thinking of this juncture, I think there's a kind of a privileged spot for the post-war period. Putting the contingent back in, I mentioned, and then looking at, instead of thinking in one explanation, one unicausal explanation for how you have political space defined here, reimagining this multiple vectors that are intersecting, and that the process and the contestation that emerges from these contending visions for what people want the political order to look like after the Ottomans, etc., is how you actually get the outcome that emerged there. More broadly, in terms of kind of conceptual importance, as social scientists, as humanists, etc., when we think about the Middle East or we think about beyond the Middle East and North Africa, is again, I think, just relativizing the norms that we have been shaped by that think in terms of the national. So how do you think out of the nation state? One is thinking in different scales and thinking in multiple dimensions. So this is the local, the national, the regional, the global, none of which function out of contact with the others. So the multiple dimension is beyond a two-dimensional, but 3, 4. Thinking instead of, again, these unitary political spaces in which you have a state sovereign that exercises a monopoly, the norm is plurality and overlap and intersection of multiple sovereignties, multiple claims, etc. I mentioned that, thinking outside the national. And then again, thinking in terms of process, instead of just taking a political space as a given, in which you then go, I'm not asking everyone to do this, but being aware of the political space itself, the definition of political space as an outcome that has to be dealt with, has to be theorized. And then the final thing is, how does this connect to the present? There's much more to talk about here, but I think what we can think of, if we do get this kind of critical distance, which history helps us get that leverage and that perspective on, is that you get a spectrum, even in the present, you have a spectrum of settled and unsettled political spaces in the region. In Libya, this has devolved into a hyper-pluralized and local environment with contending actors vying for control there. In Syria and Iraq, it's also multipolar, it's pluralized with both state and non-state actors, and again, those beg the definition of who we're classifying as state and non-state and who does the classification, etc. But state-like and non-state-like actors. You have these emergent spaces that are being created, they're being forged through violence, and you also have an incredibly dense overlapping of extra local interest. Regional, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, Israel, international, United States, European Union, and very directly Russia. I mean, Assad's in Moscow right now. So this is, I think, I've not solved this puzzle by any means, but I hopefully have opened up some questions and opened up some perspectives that do, kind of by looking within the activities that we do as scholars of the region, thinking of ways that conceptually, as we start to try to rework our categories and how we approach the topic, I'm not hugely optimistic that we then have direct policy guidance to call up Obama and say something, but it can hopefully create some sort of a maybe bigger questions of marks about interventionism and some of the practical boots on the ground or bombs in the air type of decision making that goes on, that I mean, optimistically we can have some sort of a voice speaking into. So thanks so much, and Q&A afterwards.